everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Attachment Theory in Action podcast. I am very excited today to welcome my guest, Jason Shiers. Jason is the founder of the Infinite Recovery Project, a pioneering approach to addiction recovery that breaks away from traditional pathologizing models. Drawing from his own lived experience of addiction, trauma, and transformation, Jason combines deep personal insight with professional training as a certified psychotherapist. His work challenges outdated ideas of addiction and recovery, offering a human, hopeful pathway for individuals and organizations seeking lasting change. Through the Infinite Recovery Project, Jason helps people not just overcome addiction, but rediscover their innate capacity for freedom, connection, and wholeness. I am super excited to dive into these topics with Jason today, as well as learn more about his new book, The Infinite Recovery Project, The Intelligence of Addiction. Well, hi, everybody, and welcome, Jason, to the Attachment Theory in Action podcast. I'm really excited to have you here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And I'm also interested to find out what we're going to say, because I don't know either.
We'll see where the conversation goes. And, I'm just going to add to a little personal plug, of course. You're from my homeland, so it's always a pleasure for me to have somebody from the island
Yeah.
on the pod with me. So Jason, I always start my podcast with the same question to my guests, and that is there anything in your life, your personal experiences that has really led you to the work that you're doing today, in the addiction and therapy world?
That's such a huge question, isn't it? I mean, it can be anyway, but of course, I think I only do what I do because I wanted transformation. I wanted peace for myself. I hear many noble stories, but I think everyone's the same. We got into this work because there was something about ourselves that we wanted to know more. And that certainly was true for me because my early life was extremely disruptive, chaotic, crazy, and but way beyond most. I mean, I've been a therapist for a long time, more than a couple of decades, and I hear a lot of stories, and my own story tends to be one of the most crazy ones that I've heard. Sure, I hear some more different things, but it was just extreme. What's a good word for it? Because one of my parents was killed when I was very young, and the other one basically left. She didn't leave fully, but she basically left. From a form of any attachment position. She left. And so if people ask me what was your childhood like, I would say it was like work it out for yourself. That's how it was. So I was kind of born into a world, having suffered this tragedy experience as a 5-year-old boy, and then from then on, I had to work it out for myself. So I became extremely intelligent, good at loads of things, clever, highly sensitive because of finding safety. I didn't have any safety, but extremely disruptive in my internal will to escape myself. So food was the first drug I took. It was reliable, it was consistent, it gave me peace and comfort. Into money and crime, into the mental health psychiatric system by the time I was 10, into being sectioned and locked up by the time I was a teenager. So it was a chaotic story of doing anything I could to be free of myself, to escape my internal experience, to not feel what was going on inside of me. And in that, loads of good things, like I got a full scholarship at one of the highest prestigious private schools, but my behavior was so chaotic I couldn't maintain staying there. Yeah, lots of bad things, crime and being brought home by the police, being arrested and locked up and psychiatrically medicated and stuff like that. They just carried on into drug addiction and homelessness, prisons, institutions, psychiatric interventions, everything that I could to escape being me, until I went to rehab when I was 23. And really, I guess the question is, how did I come to do this work? And it was really that at first I didn't want to be a counselor or a therapist because everyone who got clean from drugs and alcohol was like, I want to be a counselor, you know, and I was like, do you know, is there nothing else anyone wants to do? So I really felt this aversion to it. Like, I do not want to do that, you know, because everyone else is doing it and I don't want to be like everyone else. So I got into IT. I became really good at IT. I've got a smart mind. I was good at that. But along the journey for myself, whereas I went into 12-step recovery and I found that my coping mechanism was taken away, drugs and alcohol, but I had nothing to replace it with. So I picked up food again as soon as I was clean. I was 150 kilos by the time I was 9 months clean. Um, and then relationships and dysfunction and chaos, like, because my internal world was still, my nervous system was still in tatters. You know, I didn't know safety if it bit me, you know.
Mhm.
And the 12 steps is really just a belief system that gets papered over the top of all this internal dis-ease. So I continued to escape myself in any way possible that wasn't drugs or alcohol. And in that journey, I decided, well, if I could become a psychotherapist, like, and everyone else was becoming a counselor, like a person-centered counselor. So I went off saying, what's the most complicated therapy, the most complex and strong theory that's really not counseling? And I came up with transactional analysis. That's why I ended up studying transactional analysis, becoming a psychotherapist. And then doing all sorts of other psychotherapies because at the end of each one, I felt no better. You know, I'd gone
Mhm.
through this kind of process. And yeah, I'd just been on a lifelong journey of finding freedom, you know, like, because there was a point when I was a psychotherapist specializing in addiction. My clients were therapists who worked in treatment centers, and all of us had secret addictions. You know, I had secret addictions that I didn't disclose to my clients. They disclosed their secret addictions to me because I was longer clean and safe and in that recovery community. And I was thinking, what's going on here? How does anyone get help? You know?
Mhm.
And one thing I never gave up on through it all, I gave up, like, I certainly had a collapse, you know, inside myself, like a, a resignation to life, you know, like, this is how it's going to be, you know, it's going to be
Mhm.
binge eating, it's going to be cosmetic surgery, trying to fix my outside body, it's going to be on and off dieting, it's going to be toxic relationships, pornography, dysfunction. That's it. That's all I'm destined for. I'd had that collapse. But then there was a part of me which I call the pilot light, you know, the internal longing that never doesn't go out, you know, it doesn't go out for anyone. If there's
Mhm.
a glimmer of hope, there's something. So every time something new would pop up, I would be like, oh, that's interesting. What's that? You know, I want to try that. So I went to Tony Robbins, I went to the Hoffman process, I went to the Landmark Forum, I did all these things in the hope of finding respite until I had what I would call an awakening experience. You know, that was when I was 22 years clean with lots of qualifications that hadn't helped me. And from that moment on, everything changed. You know, it was really an awakening to the fact that life was happening inside of me and not outside of me.
Mhm.
And prior to that moment, it really looked like life was about spinning the plates the right way, like getting the right ducks in a row, if you call it that, or um, finding the absolute correct set of external circumstances around relationships, health, my body, weight, and my career. If I could get those things right, then I would feel okay. And in that uh, futile pursuit of finding those things, you know, I ended up in the realization that those things had nothing to do with my internal world. And actually I could have peace and happiness and contentment right now, this moment, regardless of my external circumstances. And I want to clarify, like, sometimes when I share about it, people say, oh, you can't just reframe your life like that. But it wasn't a cognitive realization. It was a deep existential embodied realization, you know, that changed everything physically, nervous system, residually, um, cognitively. It was like my whole reflection of myself, you know, as an idea, like, as I related to myself, changed, you know, like, not by thinking positively, but by knowing absolute certainty that I am not damaged and I have never been damaged. And actually to quantify that realization, 35 years of eating disorder, and I mean extreme eating disorder, 7 cosmetic surgeries in 4 different countries, desperately trying to change my external body. Years of yo-yo dieting, extreme dieting, injecting myself with substances, trying to curb my appetite, taking diet pills, and so on, disappeared that day. It's never come back.
Mm.
Um, I just stopped going to meetings after 22 years, realizing that I'm not an addict. It's not true, that story that I've been telling. Um, and that's really how I got to this work. There's more things that happened in that kind of existential realization, but that was a pivotal, the huge moment. There'd been huge moments along the way. Getting clean was a huge moment, like when I was 23. But that moment changed everything in my relationship with myself and life itself.
Was there was there something you could pinpoint that triggered that moment for you?
There was, and it's not like it's not.
If you want to share, please don't
Yeah,
feel that you
yeah,
have to
yeah.
share.
I don't mind, but what I caveat it with is you can't copy it. It's not a process that people can go, "Oh, I
Right.
can do that." Um, because the mind always wants to know, right? Well, how do you do that? If you just let me know, I'll go and do it, or I'll
True.
share it with my people, and they'll do it as well. And that's a common question, and it's not a linear or a binary kind of realization or process. It's really like a I don't know if you've ever read about Eckhart Tolle's realization, where he said that I realized I was thinking I was depressed, and then I realized there must be two of me. Like, if I'm thinking I must be depressed, who's the one thinking and who's the one who's depressed?
Mm.
And it was
Mm.
like this gap appears between Jason and who I am. That was the
Hmm.
best way I could say it, because the question that I got asked was, I talked about all my life, my dad being killed, all this stuff, drug addiction, mental health system, diagnosis. And the guy said to me, he said, "Is that happening now?" And I said, "Well, no, it's not happening now. It happened years ago." And he said, "Well, how come you're still living your life as if it's happening now?"
Mm.
And I just thought, I don't know. How come I'm doing that? And it's like, and then I realized that I am the one creating the story of Jason.
Mm.
I'm the one holding the concept that I call Jason. I'm the narrator of the experience. And then I started looking at this internal experience that I was having of myself. Like, who is Jason? Like I'm not my age, I'm not my gender, I'm not all these things. I'm something beyond that. There's something inside of me that is beyond that. And actually, I've spent my whole life feeling like I'm broken, like I'm fragile, like I'm wounded, like I'm a trauma survivor. But that's what I'm telling myself also.
Mhm.
I'm narrating the story. And actually, my whole life, I've got 100% track record of being okay. Always been okay. I've always made it. In
Mhm.
fact, I'm infinitely resilient, clearly from my track record. So, like, who is that person? Not who is the victim, the wounded, the survivor, but who is that, that's made it through all this stuff, that's okay. And that's the foundation of my work with people now. Like, I call it a model of health and not a model of illness. Like, let's
Mm.
look towards what's right with people instead of what's wrong with people. Let's see how the intelligence of your system, of your nervous system, of your mind has been keeping you safe and protecting you all along, and how where that stemmed from, and how it's actually working exactly as it should do, not in a faulty way. Nothing's been faulty about my life. Nothing's been because I'm broken or wired up wrong, as I believed before that experience. But then I start to see everything through the lens of intelligence. Of course I did that. Of course that happened. Of course I used drugs and alcohol to escape myself. I was a 5-year-old boy with a tragic and cosmic loss. Doesn't it make
Mhm.
sense? And the more I looked through that lens of intelligence, of seeing, of course, this stuff makes perfect sense, the less damaged I felt, the less broken I felt, the less story I had about myself, and the whole narrative of myself started to change, from that.
Um, First of all, thank you very much for sharing your story with myself and our listeners as well. I I fully appreciate the. I think we talked about this in our previous conversation, but it's a vulnerable place to be at. Even if you are at a place where you are of acceptance of it, I still want to acknowledge that vulnerability. So I appreciate that. A question I have or a thought that I have as you're talking is, um, I I'm going to assume that this wasn't, I mean, you said it changed in the moment, but did it take continued work to keep kind of retransforming that narrative?
It's like this is metaphoric, right? I can't explain it because it doesn't exist as a thing in the world that that the
Hmm.
mind can understand. Um, the initial impact of what I realized never disappeared, to the point that it changed the trajectory of my life, and it changed my focal point of what was going on. So instead of like being too focused on what was wrong with me, now because of how conditioning works for people, like when you've been conditioning yourself your whole life with a narrative about what's wrong with you, there's still lingering conditioning that you're not even aware of, that hangs around, perhaps things you do
Hmm.
when you're on autopilot, half asleep and stuff. So I often talk about, and I wrote in my book, there was two people in my life that were given to me as mentors. Um, and for a few years, every now and again, I would come up with a story as to what was wrong with me, Now, these two people would never, ever buy it, no matter how I convinced them. Look, if you'd had 15 different mental health diagnoses like me, if you'd been sectioned as many times that I had, if you'd been a drug addict, if you'd stole from your parents at home and all that, got kicked out of home, been homeless like I have, then you'd understand why this place of well-being must be damaged to some extent. And they were like, no, that's bullshit. It's not true. It's not true for anybody. It doesn't matter what you've done. There's a place of well-being inside of you. And because of those people seeing the beauty in me, I started to see it more and more in myself. And the more I looked for it and the more I saw it, so it was like this journey of willingness to move towards myself, rather than propping myself up with external structures of community or belief or conceptual ideas about what human beings behavior or psychotherapeutic concepts or anything like that, but more about going inwardly to myself and the source of well-being within myself. So it didn't take work to maintain the trajectory and the impact of it, but like there was deeper, there was more to see, and there still is deeper. I think they'll be deeper forever.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, and as you're talking, I'm starting to really hear the attachment piece come through. Like those two people who constantly challenged you, I really feel are almost the epitome of that secure attachment figure that
Yeah.
we hope we can be for our children. And so, uh, tell me a little bit more about your thoughts about, okay, so you've gone through this journey, you have discovered this kind of shift in this internal shift for yourself. But what are the implications do you feel for parents raising children or caregivers raising a child? What might have been different for you if experiences had been different?
Can you just clear what you mean? Like what
Well,
way we're looking?
I I'm thinking, let's start with my first question. So what maybe are the implications of your story, and how can caregivers and parents maybe learn some from your story?
Yeah. I, the realization that experience is happening inside of me and not outside of me is massive, because I would say, I don't know the number, but let's just say 90% of the world really think that experience is outside of them. They're conditioned into that. They're unknowingly entered into a rat race, and they participate in it without even knowing it. Like more job, more money, bigger house, bigger car, better relationship, lose weight, all these things that people are externally focused on. because they're unknowingly entered into this rat race at birth. They're conditioned into it. Now, for me, stepping out of that, like to some extent, we're all in it to some extent because we could
Hmm.
exist as humans in a society, but um, seeing that experience happens inside of me, seeing that I always had everything I needed, seeing that um, externally I couldn't be impacted by things, and whether the things were not the happiness and so on, allowed me to parent completely different, because then I started to trust in my, particularly my older child, because my youngest is still 8, so he's not really there yet, but in my older child, it allowed me to let her be. It allowed me to let her find a way. It allowed me to talk to her like another human being person, instead of having to be this strict dad that needed to impose his views on her. And um, that's massive, I think, because I think what I noticed in a lot of parents come to me um, with children in crisis, addiction, suicide, and so on, usually teenagers around 20 years old, quite often. And there's a real difficulty, which I understand, in allowing children, to grow, allowing them to learn for themselves, allowing them to be, and there's such a strong desire to control and know what's best for them, from parents. And I see that by being willing not to know as a parent, being willing not to be right as a dad, that's hard with a teenage daughter, like being willing not to be
Hmm.
right, and letting her. uh, It's quite touching for me, to talk about, because um, I see now my daughter, she's 15, and she's so wise, like wise, like beyond anything, like with that I see with other kids, in her understanding of people and how we all work and so on and stuff. And of course, she still have struggles. And of course, I think all of us to some extent mess our kids up, like not on purpose, but because we can't be that perfect, meet all those needs parent that we thought we
Hmm.
might have been at some point, but it's been very beautiful to me to go through that and witness um, the beauty of that, in one child, and in the other child I have, uh, it's a bit more challenging because he's 8 years old, and for the last 3 years he's been that reflection for me of the
Hmm.
tenderness of a young boy at 5 years old, and um, how much he needs me, how much he clings to me, how much love he needs, and how sensitive he is, and he's been a gift to me for that, because I really got to see how that would have been for me. And I talked about this in my own therapy, like, if we're just using our head to look at memories of our childhood, sometimes we feel some stuff and we think about some stuff. But when you've got a child in front of you that's a direct reflection of yourself, it's almost like I feel everything that he felt,
Hmm.
as in his day or whatever's going on. And then from that, I get to reflect on my own journey. So he's been a beautiful gift for me to really get in touch with some stuff within myself, about my own experience. So both of them taught me something different. I think I went off on a tangent there, but both
No, that's
both of them have been great, in that.
no, that's absolutely fine. For me, what I hear, the theme that I hear throughout your description of both your children is that you are that unconditional safe base for them. You are that
Yeah,
secure attachment figure. And I completely agree with the shift in how you view yourself, and that there is that you were never damaged, and a lot of the perceptions that you had of yourself were from these external influences, but inside you were never damaged. And I completely agree with that. And I think that the challenge comes though is when that is I talk about in my work, what let me say it, phrase it right, but what starts outside goes inside. You know, when we're talking about attachment, it's a relational experience, right? So a child, an infant develops what's inside based on what's coming in from the outside, um, with, I would say, a little bit of their own self too, but a lot of it is determined on that attachment figure that they develop that relationship with. And so, you know, I hear in your experiences with your children that you are shifting that narrative with them, that you are giving them a different experience to what you had based on what you know now. And you're seeing the the results of that, um, which is absolutely wonderful. And I think that I just want to make sure that our listeners are hearing that yes, you've done all this amazing work and you've recognized that there are internal parts of you that are not damaged. But those internal parts have been shaped by those external figures in those early years of life. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's all trauma response, right? Like everything is like an internal perception of an external experience. That's kind of my early life, my internal response, intelligent
Right.
response, right? That's why I
Yes.
talk about intelligence, because it makes sense that I responded that way to the environment that I had, you know, and all children are resilient and intelligent, you know, like their
Hmm.
nervous system adapts to find a way to cope with external adversity. And um, nothing's faulty, you know, none of
Hmm.
it's working
Hmm.
wrongly. Even when children are behaving in certain ways, it's always a cry for something. It's a longing for something. It's a something's missing. They're not seen, they're not heard, they don't feel important, whatever's going on for them. And I think that's, yeah, an essential part of this, what we're talking about, you know.
Right. No, thank you, Jason. You explained that so beautifully. Uh, yeah, I don't want people to hear that the child or the young person or even the young adult is I think fully responsible of taking care of that themselves, right?
Yeah, no, definitely
Mhm.
not. I'm certainly not saying that. And it's an essential piece of the puzzle to see that everything is perception based, you know, and
Mhm.
like the nervous system autonomic, you know, happens, it adapts in the moment, you know, there's not a choice. The child's not making um decisions about themselves, but their nervous system is adapting for safety. That's the physical and somatic part of it. But the mental construct and so on, you know, that goes on, people,
Mhm.
children believe things about themselves based on the external, the perception of the external environment and the behavior of the people around them. So sure, it's all internalized response, you know, nobody's um taking responsibility. It's not a choice, you know, that's going on there. And it's, in fact, you could almost say it's just completely automatic. It's just how we work as human beings, you know.
Absolutely. Um, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk. Tell us a bit more. Tell us about your book, okay? You know, you mentioned earlier about you have trained in all these modalities and models, and you know, still felt like something was missing. Tell us a bit about your book and how your approach has kind of been developed and evolved.
Yeah. What I found with most approaches where there was a fundamental that was essential to the piece of healing that wasn't present. And even though people would say, well, I don't see people as broken, there was connotations in the way that the work or the model was created that that's what was really going on, you know. And I mean, I made a video about this recently. It's like if I'm the professional and you're the client and you come to me and you say, oh, this is what's going on, and I either pathologize, give you a diagnosis or a story of personality disorder or something, and I say to you also, "Yeah, but I can help you fix that. You know, I can help you with that." What I innocently do is confirm to that person that I too believe I'm colluding with them in a way to believe that there's something wrong with them, you know.
Mm.
And I'm not only that, because of social conditioning and perceived status, they've come to me for help. I'm a professional, I know more than them. That's just an innocent social conditioning that most people hold. They go away like taking that belief of mine that I've passed on to them to be confirmation that they are broken and damaged. Now that's the fundamental piece where my work is different, because I call it a model of well-being and not a model of illness. So there's never a time when I'm saying, oh yeah, that's bad. You know, it's like, I can help you with that. You know, it's like, but
Hmm.
there's definitely something wrong with you there. You've got this, or this. I'm saying, well, how can we, doesn't that make sense? Doesn't everything make sense? If we really understand how it works, we can see everything through that lens. And then people are filled with hope rather than filled with dread. You know, oh, you mean this is, I'm okay, I'm not broken. And like then people are more willing to engage and be curious about themselves and their experience, you know. And um,
I think it breaks the shame right
breaks
away
the shame. It takes
from
away the
it.
stigma in addiction and mental health. There's no stigma. There's nothing wrong with you. Everything's
Hmm.
right with you. This is your biological organism, the human body that is wired for safety, adapted in a way to keep you safe. It worked as it
Hmm.
was meant to work, and then
Hmm.
we just see it that way. So then vulnerability, while still the nervous system is not resistant, but kind of checks for safety, let's say, you know, in any
Hmm.
relationship before vulnerability comes out. When people are not believing there's something wrong or there's no shame attached to it, you know, that journey comes easier for people to go towards themselves. And so I call it psycho-spiritual, you know, there's a, everything's a concept when it's discussed by the mind and delivered in a language, right? That's what it is. It's a concept. But really, my book is written in a way that says very clearly, don't listen to me, because I'm not asking you to take on my new concept or my belief. What I'm pointing you to is what's within yourself.
Hmm.
So the whole thing is about looking inwardly towards yourself to find answers within yourself. And my guidance is to help you do that versus you needing me or to follow me or to learn my way in order to be okay. I make it very clear that I don't know anything you don't as the reader. You know, you actually know this stuff that I'm pointing to. It all exists within you. And all I'm really doing is helping you uncover it.
Hmm.
And that's, you know, people change, transformation happens, you know, so much quicker. There's still residual tension of the nervous system. There's still somatic adaptation. There's still triggers and reactions that happen in response to stimulus, to life. But that's a different journey. When the way I say it is, if you're on one side of the mountain and I'm on the other, what you're going to see is completely different to me. Now, if I say to you, come round to my side and have a look from here, you might see something similar to what not exactly the same, but something similar to what I see. So I'm asking people to come and look from a different direction at what they think the problem is. And from
Hmm.
that position, everything looks different. The journey home, meaning the journey to well-being within yourself or to healing or whatever you want to call it, you know, like to go towards yourself, to, if you like the word God or the universe, to realize God or the universe within yourself, you know, whatever you prefer that journey to be called, is different, you know?
Um, I'm just, I love hearing about your perspective, Jason. I love that. To me, yes, you mentioned about, you know, there's the somatic piece, there's the nervous system piece, but I all I hear in what you're talking about in your approach is attachment, because you really are being that attachment figure in that person's journey. And I love, you know, first of all, I want to say too that, you know, there'll be a lot of clinicians listening to this, therapists, counselors, and I want to take a moment to reflect on, you know, what you mentioned about, you know, the trouble with a lot of modalities is that there is still that perception that someone is broken and they've come to you to be fixed. And um you know, I think a lot of professionals out there, they don't maybe have they haven't had that realization, and not through any fault of their own.
Yeah.
But I love that you're highlighting that fact that there's this subtext that says you're here for me to fix you.
Yeah.
versus you already have inside of you what you need to move to a place of healing or to feel better, to have this wellness, right? That you're
Yeah.
describing. And so I love that distinction that you're making. And I want to make sure our listeners know that I think that they can help, they can move towards that, even if they are using a therapy that maybe feels like, reinforces that idea of damage. I think that with their own dialogue that they have with clients, their own approach could reduce some of that.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, I'm putting on some webinars for therapists about addiction as an intelligence, and the thing about it is that I often say is you can only guide someone to what you've seen yourself about well-being. So it has to be an experiential journey. You can't learn this of the mind. You can't learn it in a book and then help somebody see their well-being if you haven't seen your own. If you
Mm-hmm.
haven't seen the beauty inside yourself that exists, you can't point someone else to theirs. And um, yeah, it's not to make anyone wrong. Of course, nobody's malicious, nobody's intently hurting anybody
Mm-hmm.
or perpetuating people's suffering. That is what innocently happens, though. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't mean it as a criticism because I did it too. What I mean it as, uh, when we become willing to go towards ourselves and to learn about ourselves and to feel all that vulnerability and that stuff we've stuffed away and hidden and covered over with letters and expertise and status and so on, when we become willing to drop that out and go towards ourselves, as perhaps a vulnerable child, like inside of ourselves, then our human to human connection, like the attachment stuff you talked about, the capacity for that increases massively, and our capacity to hold space and to be in relationship with our client, not as an expert, not as a professional with letters after my name, PhD, BACP, whatever, but just
Mm-hmm.
as human to human, because the presence piece with clients as human to human is very healing, and essential to that journey. So uh, yeah, that's the bit I would add. It can't be learned, and it has to be felt. It has to be a journey that you're willing to go on yourself.
And is that something that you also um, discuss with parents and caregivers? You talked earlier about you have families that
Yeah,
will come and you have maybe an older, someone in their mid-20s child who is struggling with addiction.
yeah.
Um, how do you help those parents or caregivers realize that they have to do some of this internal work too?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's where I go first all the time, and it's always like responded to with shock. Me? I'm perfect. It's not me, it's them. I don't mean that in a condescending way, but like just that the the shock of it. It's kind of like because nobody thinks it's them. Everyone thinks they're bringing somebody else to get help because they need help and they don't. And quite often, I mean, even the initial question of do they really want help? Because the parent contact first, right? There was, oh, it's about my child, and I'll be like, well, this might seem like a strange question, but do they really want help? Have they come to you and said, can you get me help? And almost, let's say 99% of the time, the answer, when I dig in enough and ask it in enough ways, the
Mm-hmm.
answer is always no. It's always no. And it's like, but I think they want help, but I'm sure they will take help. There's some version of it. So then I say, okay, then, so I can work with you first, because actually you are the closest person to them. And if you can form an attachment with them, that's better than me having an attachment with them. If
Mm-hmm.
I can help you to form that attachment with your child, that's going to be 100 times more beneficial to them than me doing it. So are
Mm-hmm.
you willing to look yourself? Are you willing to go on that journey towards yourself to see how you can be more helpful and useful? And they're like, well, what does that mean? What does that even mean to go on a journey towards myself? Well, we look inwardly, like what's happening right now. We can start there.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening right now inside your body, and it's like, oh, that's how we go inwardly, like we do it experientially. So it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same for parents as it is for therapists, trainers, psychiatrists, doctors, whoever they are, that unless you've gone on that journey towards yourself, your relational impact will be less.
Mm-hmm. So how, well, I think you kind of have answered my question, but I'm sitting here thinking about having these conversations with parents or caregivers, and I have this, vision of them, the response being, so you're telling me it's my fault?
Yeah. Well, that's where the intelligence piece comes in, because it's like we're removing the stigma from the start. We're never
Mhm,
saying there's something wrong anyway. We're actually seeing
mhm,
how it makes sense. Where there is a challenge sometimes is the use of the word trauma is never that helpful because it's kind of like parents automatically take not offense, but they start to feel shame and guilt. So they want to shut down and close down or change the subject, or maybe they get angry or something like that happens. And so it's really helping them see that it's an intelligent response to internal adversity. And the internal adversity is perception based, it's not necessarily a fault. And I quite
mhm.
often, the film 8 Mile, where he kind of like throws out all his rubbish in the rap battle at the start. So I call it 8 miling myself. I throw myself under the bus and I say, I have messed up my kids terribly. It's like, so it I don't mind sharing that, because it's true. All of us do that to some extent. We can't get it perfect. So it's somehow easing the tension of feeling like the sense of responsibility of, have I done something wrong for the parent? So there's ways to, the ways that, one, what we're actually looking at, what's going on here. Is it a fault, a flaw, or is it an intelligent response to something? And then two, we all do that as parents. We can't get it right. There's no way to get it right. And then like gently, I mean, this is such a can of worms, right? Quite often, 3 months into working with somebody, they'll tell you something about abuse or rape or violence or something in a child's life, in an early life, that you didn't know about, and things like
Mhm.
that. So uh, sometimes people don't disclose stuff for a long time, and depending on how far they're willing to trust you and be in relationship with you. I mean, you probably know yourself, you can be very present and do everything right for safety, really show up, check in with yourself and take supervision, do all those things. And sometimes it doesn't necessarily mean people are just going to come and tell you everything straight away, right? so
Right.
so who knows, things unfold along the way, right?
Hmm, hmm. Um, Jason, my mind is just, I'm so full of the conversation that we're having and the just your discussion. Your work is so very valuable. I want to just wrap up by talking. You mentioned earlier a little bit about this being a spiritual approach. Did you want to add any more context to that? Like maybe any part of your journey that's been on the more spiritual side of things?
Yeah. um I think like my realization is was a spiritual awakening, and by that I mean that to realize that there's something more going on than what I thought. Most people, I say the word most, and I really hate these kind of grandiose kind of words, everybody, all the time, most people, but I need to use language to express something. So I don't really mean most people, but I'm just going to say that word because that's just so you get what I mean. Um, Most people just believe the content of their thinking to be about themselves, and that's all there is.
Mm,
They're living the narrative of their own mind. Now, the spiritual awakening part is to see that there's something more going on. There's something more to me. There's something more to life, of who we are as human beings, having a spiritual experience. Like the discovery also in that realization of that there's a source of life that flows through me, the same source of life that flows through all human beings. It has to be the same because we're all of the same, design, so to speak, as a human being. We're different on the
mhm,
outside and so
mhm,
on, and we're unique and we have unique conditioning. But the energy of us, the aliveness of us is a unexplainable force, like nature, like the
mhm,
leaves fall off the tree every year and they come back. That
mhm,
part of being human is is universal, so like seeing that universal aliveness that flows through all human beings when you see it in yourself, and then that sees ways that we're all connected. Well, not our differences, but our similarities in how we're all made up that way. So it's a spiritual awakening to a depth beyond what we think, a realization that there's more playing out here in this experience of being human than meets the eye.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, I've done a lot of spiritual explorations, and kind of dug deeply into some Eastern traditions, that really, if you move towards them and are willing to investigate yourself through that lens, you cannot argue with the fact that there's a oneness to life. We're all having exactly an internal experience. We're all having a relative body, an experience of the physical and somatic, but in our mind, we're all connected. We're all part of the same greater awareness. Now,
Mm-hmm.
the mind can't grasp that. You can't go, oh yeah, I can see how that's true, and really know it, But if you're willing to investigate your own mind and your own experience, and I've watched investigations and I've done investigations and I've been on my own, I've come to a point where I've gone, oh shit, yeah, that's really true. That has to be true. I can't see anything else but that being true. And what that gives me is a greater capacity to see the good in people, to see the beauty in people, to see the intelligence in all these pathologies and diagnoses and therapies, and to see the beauty in the creativity of life, even if it's not helpful. To say, oh my God, yeah, the same. Let's say we talk about somebody famous, like I like to talk about Einstein. Like Einstein's kind of had the complicated theory of relativity, but also talked about simplicity. Like if you can't understand it simply, you don't understand it well enough, right? So then like saying,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so the same spark of energy that came through this guy is the same life that's in every person. So everyone has the capacity, infinite capacity for well-being, the infinite capacity for creativity, the infinite capacity for aliveness, in the world. And that's the spiritual part of it for me. It gives me such a greater perspective and such a more hopeful and beautiful perspective of what's going on in the world.
You finished there with a word that was in my mind, hope.
Yeah,
That it really does provide that sense of hope that we have, that we all have that capacity within us, as you identified.
yeah.
Um, Jason, I think that's a wonderful place for us to stop for today. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Your story is profound. Your journey has been profound and will continue to be. I have absolutely no doubt about that. And yeah, if people haven't read your book, The Infinite Recovery, I hope that they do. And we will be sharing the links in the show notes. And just thank you again for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for being curious, asking questions, and being a host. You create the conversation. So I reflect it back to you. Thank you.